Good evening, and welcome to the first event of the 2023-2024 academic year at the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College. With support from the college, the Young Center fosters and promotes the study of Anabaptist and Pietist traditions in their varied expressions. And this evening, we are considering the origins of the Moravian Church, one of the more consequential expressions of Pietist Christianity. Moravian origins, it turns out, were more complicated and interesting than historians and members of the Moravian Church have long thought. With a fresh for a fresh look at Moravian origins based on thousands of documents from archives in both Germany and the United States, we turn to Dr. Paul Peucker, recipient of this year's Dale W. Brown Book Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. I'll introduce Dr. Peucker more completely in a moment, but first a word about the Brown Award. Since 2004, the Young Center has annually recognized scholarship that makes creative contributions to our understanding of Anabaptism or Pietism. The award also honors the significant contribution of Church of the Brethren theologian, historian, and peace activist Dale Brown. Brown was a professor at Bethlehem Theological Seminary for 30 years, and following his retirement in 1993, Dale and his wife Lois moved to Elizabethtown and made this community their home for many years and were important supporters of the Young Center. Friends of Dale and Lois generously contributed funds to establish this award in his name. Lois Kaufman Brown passed away in 2015, and Dale died 2 years ago at age 95. This evening, the 2023 Dale Brown Award recognizes Dr. Peucker and his book, Herrnhut, The Formation of a Moravian Community, 1722 to 1732, published last year by Penn State University Press. The book offers an altogether new look at Moravian origins and demonstrates how this community was able to survive despite existing regulations against new religious roots in early modern Germany. And we do have copies of the book for sale in the lobby. Paul Peucker is archivist for the Moravian Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He holds a doctorate in history from the University of Utrecht, the Netherlands, and a degree from the State Archives School in The Hague. He worked as archivist at the Moravian Archives in Herrnhut, Germany, before becoming director of archives for the Moravian Church here in Pennsylvania, and has been in that role since 2004. Peucker is the managing editor of the Journal of Moravian History and the author of A Time of Sifting, Mystical Marriage and the Crisis of Moravian Piety in the 18th Century. It was published in 2015. His more recent book, Herrnhut, was published simultaneously in English and German. Mentioned he reports that he wrote it in English and then translated into German, and was published simultaneously in 2 languages, neither of which are his first language. That is his first language. So another impressive fact of Dr. Peucker's scholarship. Welcome.
Thank you for these kind words, and I'll thank the Young Center for the award. I thank the anonymous judges who reviewed the book. I'm truly honored to receive this award. And as you can hear, English is not my native language, so whenever I write something, it needs to be reviewed and corrected by someone else, and I'm especially grateful to my spouse, Jeffrey Long, for reviewing hundreds of draft pages of the Herrnhut book. And I would like to thank you for coming here tonight. I'm delighted to see you here. Thank you for showing interest in my book. Why are you writing a book on Herrnhut was something that people asked me when I was working on the book. Don't we already know everything there is to know? It is a good question. Why do we need a new book on early Herrnhut? The story about the beginnings of Herrnhut is well known and repeated in many publications. And the traditional narrative goes as follows. The Unitas Fratrum, or unity of brethren, was founded in 1457 in Bohemia. This church had gone underground during the 1600s, but some, the so-called hidden sea, remained faithful to the beliefs of their ancestors. In the 1720s, Count Zinzendorf allowed some of them to settle on his land and to build the town of Herrnhut. After times of conflict and dissension, the people of Herrnhut united under the leadership of Zinzendorf. During a communion service in the nearby church of Bertelsdorf on August 13, 1727, the Herrnhuters united as brothers and sisters. From that time on, according to the traditional story, the previously lost Church of the Unity of Brethren was renewed in Herrnhut and spread around the globe. When I started this project, I had all kinds of questions. I wanted to know what were the expectations and plans when Herrnhut was founded. What were Zinzendorf's plans when he bought the Bertelsdorf estate? What were the plans and expectations of the Moravian settlers? And what does it mean that so many of the early settlers of Herrnhut did not come from Moravia, but from other parts of Germany and beyond? Why would these people want to join a religious community that was intended to be the renewal of an extinct Czech church? And what was this renewal about? What exactly does it mean that the people in Herrnhut believed God had renewed the church of their ancestors? I thought there were plenty of unanswered questions that made it worthwhile to take another look at the early history of Herrnhut, and by doing that, at the beginning of the modern Moravian Church. This book is not the history of a local town. It is the history of the origins of the worldwide religious movement. Dale Brown, after whom this award has been named, says its impact on the 18th century was dynamic, and its influence was felt by many, including the Wesley brothers in England. End of quote. Herrnhut was one of the important phenomena in religious history of the 18th century. It was a successful attempt to establish a new religious community outside of the official denominations. It shook up the world of German pietism. The Herrnhut movement quickly spread throughout Europe and beyond. It gained a foothold in the American colonies and established mission stations throughout the world. By the end of the 1720s, 220 people lived in Herrnhut, and the community was corresponding with the King of Prussia, the Queen of England, the Crown Prince of Denmark, and even with the Pope in Rome. In the 1730s, people from Herrnhut went as missionaries to the Caribbean, Greenland, South Africa, Suriname, and Georgia. During the 1740s, they founded sister communities throughout Germany, the Netherlands, England, and Pennsylvania. In 1822, a century after Herrnhut was founded, the Moravian Church had over 50,000 members worldwide. In my book, I do not try to explain all the reasons for the success of the Moravian movement, but I focus on an important question. How was it possible for this community to survive when the establishment of new religious bodies in Germany was illegal? Around 1700, the religious landscape of Central Europe seemed pretty much defined. According to the stipulations of the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, three major denominations were allowed within the Holy Roman Empire: Roman Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed. It was up to the ruler to determine the religion of his subjects. Saxony, where Herrnhut was located, was Lutheran. Worship outside of the established church was not allowed. The Mennonites were only tolerated in a few parts of Europe. The prayer meetings of the pietists that were spreading throughout Germany from the 1680s onwards were usually outlawed and illegal. In 2015, after my book on the sifting time was finished, I began to dedicate my free time to research the early years of Herrnhut. Over the years, I went on research visits to the Herrnhut archives several times to take pictures of thousands of pages on my phone. But there were also important documents in the Bethlehem archives that shed important light on the history of early Herrnhut. In 2019, I had a 3-month sabbatical that I used to write large portions of the book. Herrnhut was founded on the estate of Count Zinzendorf, but in no way was Herrnhut the work of Zinzendorf alone. In the first chapter, I introduced the major players. Christian David, the Roman Catholic carpenter from Moravia, who traveled all over Central Europe to find true religion. Melchior Scheffer, the Lutheran pastor in the nearby town of Görlitz, who longed for church reform and gave Christian David a new spiritual home. Andreas Roth, the talented Lutheran minister who had declined so many calls because he did not think he was ready to be a pastor until he met Zinzendorf and heard about Zinzendorf's plan for a Christian community on Zinzendorf's estate. I talk about the Brotherhood of Four that oversaw the plans for Herrnhut, and I explained that this brotherhood, despite its name, also included women. Women were important in early Herrnhut. They provided funding, they founded schools, they formed prayer groups, and they preached. I discussed the ideals and plans of these early people. Zinzendorf and his friends can be called Philadelphians. They believed that the established churches of Europe were degenerate. The Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Reformed, and the Anglican Church. They believed the churches had developed doctrine that was far removed from the original apostolic teachings of the Bible, and the denominations were focused on their theological differences rather than what united them. True believers, Zinzendorf and his Philadelphian friends believed, were found throughout all ages and throughout all traditions. Based on their reading of the Gospel of John, the Philadelphians defined true believers as characterized by their brotherly love. These Philadelphians were trying to connect with other true children of God and to prepare for the establishment of Christ's church on earth. Some Philadelphians refused to form new organizations, fearing these new organizations would turn into sects, just like the existing churches. Others believed they needed to gather in groups, especially establish certain rules, and to make visible the true church of Christ. Zinzendorf and his friends belonged to the latter group. They wanted to form a community of true Christians, regardless of their denominational affiliation. I personally like the ideas of the Philadelphians. I like that they focus on mutual love as the most important characteristic of a believer, and they emphasize the active aspect of faith. They consider theology the work of man, and they call doctrine opinions. They want to be tolerant of other ideas, but they are also willing to call out the government and the religious establishment of their day. I think Christian David and the Moravian refugees arrived at the right moment. Zinzendorf and his friends were eager to help anyone who suffered because the government tried to suppress their freedom of conscience. They also gave refuge to the Schwenkfelders, a persecuted Christian group from Silesia who lived on Zinzendorf's estate until 1732. Unlike the Moravian refugees, the Schwenkfelders were told to leave Saxony. They left for Pennsylvania, where the Schwenkfelders survived until this day. Looking at the Schwenkfelders helped to get a better understanding of the original intentions with the community on Zinzendorf's estate. Zinzendorf did not want to enforce any religious ideas on the residents of his estate, as long as they accepted the Philadelphian principle of tolerance and mutual love. This also becomes clear from the example of the Hutterite minister from Transylvania, Heinrich Justus Meyer, who stayed in Herrnhut during the summer of 1727. During the weeks of his stay in Herrnhut, during which the Great Revival of August 13 took place, he became convinced of the Philadelphian principles of the Herrnhut community. Although he hoped to convince his brethren and sisters in Transylvania of these ideas, he was removed from his office. At least that is what the record in Herrnhut. That the Moravians later became the denomination themselves has perhaps distorted our view of early Herrnhut. Herrnhut was supposed to be a community of Christians from different denominational backgrounds who accepted each other's different opinions and based on mutual brotherly love. A large percentage of the residents of Herrnhut came from Moravia. In the traditional narratives, it is said they were descendants of the Unity of Brethren and that they wanted to re-establish their church on Zinzendorf's estate. I took a closer look at the settlers who came from Moravia and found that most Protestants had left Bohemia and Moravia much earlier during the years immediately following the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, when the Protestants were defeated. The people who came to Herrnhut came a century later. By that time, as I found based on recent study from Protestants in the Habsburg lands, most Protestants in Bohemia and Moravia had only limited knowledge of the doctrine, practice, and history of the Unity of Brethren. Their faith was a generic Protestant faith. They read whatever Protestant literature they could get hold of and did not care if it was a Lutheran book, a Reformed book, or something from the old Unity of Brethren, as long as it was not Roman Catholic. This denominational indifferentism of the settlers from Moravia worked very well with Zinzendorf's Philadelphian ideas. Zinzendorf did not force the Moravian settlers to become members of the Lutheran Church. In other places in Saxony, where refugees from Bohemia or Moravia had settled, they had to become Lutherans and obey to the Lutheran church authorities. This was not the case in Herrnhut. I was interested to find out more about the disagreements and division that took place in Herrnhut in 1726 and 1727. I studied correspondence with Johann Siegmund Peucker, the self-appointed prophet who caused so many of these problems and who eventually was placed in a mental institution in January of 1727. But although Krüger was labeled mentally ill, his criticism was adopted by Christian David and eventually by Zinzendorf himself. Krüger had warned the Herrnhuters not to become part of the Lutheran Church at Bethlehem. Zinzendorf's response was to introduce the brotherly agreement in the summer of 1727. The brotherly agreement defined Herrnhut as a separate religious body outside of the Lutheran Church and administered not by ordained ministers but by lay people, according to what they considered the original message of the Bible. Soon after the introduction of the brotherly agreement, the well-known events of August 13, 1727 happened. I wanted to get a better understanding of this religious revival that is considered to be the birth of the renewed Moravian Church, that is commemorated each year by Moravians around the world. I found that there was a building of religious fervor during the summer of 1727. And in the midst of this religious fervor, Zinzendorf made a discovery that changed everything. While reading A History of the Unity of Brethren written by Arminius, Zinzendorf came to the conclusion that much of what had existed in this earlier church had been resurrected in Herrnhut. Zinzendorf was convinced that the brotherly agreement that he had introduced earlier that year was very much the same as the statutes of the Unity of Brethren from 1464. He read Comenius' work and translated it from Latin for the people in Herrnhut. And when he came to Comenius' plea from Lamentations, where it says, "Renew our days as of old," it dawned on him that God had indeed renewed the old church in Herrnhut. Zinzendorf believed that God had used him as an instrument when he compiled the brotherly agreement that was allegedly almost identical with the statutes of the Unity of Brethren. In chapter 4, you will read the details about how Zinzendorf translated Comenius in a, let's say, rather creative way in order to create the strong suggestion that what had existed in the Unity of Brethren was identical with the organization of the Herrnhut community. And this is the first time Zinzendorf's translation has been discussed in a publication. My favorite chapters to work on were the chapters on life in Herrnhut and the beliefs and ideals of the community. The section I started to write was the section on musical life in Herrnhut, which was rich from the very beginning. Zinzendorf's next-door neighbor in the apartment building in Dresden, where he lived during these years, was the organ builder Clem, whom we know as the teacher of David Tannenberg, who later became an organ builder here in Pennsylvania. Clem built the organ for the Berthelsdorf Church in 1724 and decided he wanted to live in Herrnhut. He and his wife, however, felt disappointed about life in Herrnhut, and they decided to emigrate to Germantown in Pennsylvania. He later rejoined the Moravians, and he is buried in God's Acre in Bethlehem. These chapters shed new light on the origins of Moravian worship. There is an interesting parallel between the house worship as practiced by the Protestants in Moravia and the prayer meetings of the German pietists. You will read that the origins of the love feast, of the Moravian love feast, probably did not happen the way Moravians have always been told. An intriguing part for me is about Holy Communion in urban Herrnhut. Historians have often claimed, or perhaps better, they have repeated Zinzendorf's claim, that the Moravians celebrated communion in the Berthelsdorf Church, and it was not until the government of Saxony officially recognized the Moravian Church that communion was celebrated in Herrnhut. Yes, it is true that the Herrnhuters celebrated communion in the Berthelsdorf Church, but you can hardly call it a Lutheran communion service. They did not attend the regular Lutheran service. They had their own service for themselves, and only people who had been vetted by the Herrnhut elders were allowed to partake. The service started in the Saal or chapel in Herrnhut with a sermon by Zinzendorf. The communicants then walked to the Berthelsdorf Church where they had communion. Afterwards, they walked back to Herrnhut where they concluded with the hymn and the kiss of peace. So you see that the communion service in Berthelsdorf was framed within a larger service that began and ended in Herrnhut. This was a clever way to obey the law that communion had to take place in a Lutheran church, while in reality they celebrated according to their own ideas. I found that Zinzendorf was very good at finding solutions to protect and defend the separate religious body that existed from his state. Zinzendorf was trained as a lawyer. He knew the law, and he knew how to argue in a convincing way. To the outside, he claimed the Herrnhut community adhered to Lutheran theology and attended the parish church in Berthelsdorf. Anything that was different from Lutheran practice, he explained as a result of the old traditions of the Moravian settlers on this estate. And when the government of Saxony conducted an official investigation in 1732, they seemed to believe him. Zinzendorf at some point called this a mask. The Moravians used a mask to hide their true identity of Philadelphians behind the image of being descendants of a much older church who all adhered to Lutheran theology. The image of a mask, of course, was appealing to me, as we have all become used to wearing masks in recent years. The pandemic allowed me to finish the book and to also produce a translation into German, and both were published in time of the 300th anniversary of Herrnhut. Earlier, I summarized the traditional narrative, the way we usually tell the story of the founding of the Moravian Church. I'm not saying that the narrative is factually wrong, but I would like to change the order of the story. I'd like to begin by looking at the founding of Herrnhut and examine the people, the tradition and ideas that came together here. Instead of telling a neat chronological account, starting with Jan Hus, the founding of the Universiteit in 1457, and following that story up to the founding of Herrnhut, I begin at looking at what was happening in Herrnhut around 1720. And from this point, I look back at earlier developments to explain who the people were who gathered in Herrnhut and how they used their history to create an identity and to define their faith. Thank you. Our questions, please.
We were just at Bethlehem this year and toured the Moravian Community. Can you just make that connection for me from what you've been talking to actually Bethlehem and the Moravian Community?
Yes. So soon Moravians started to look for other places. There were still more settlers coming from Moravia who could not be, were not allowed to settle in Herrnhut. So they were looking for other places. One place seemed to be Georgia, in Savannah, Georgia, but that didn't work out. So by the end of the 1730s, the community in Savannah, the Moravian community, had fallen apart. Some of them had moved north to Germantown. Some of them had joined Conrad Weissel in Epicenter. And there were signals from Pennsylvania that people here were very interested in Philadelphian, in these Philadelphian ideas. And there was a community in Skippack, and some of the Moravians connected with that. So in 1741, Zinzendorf decided to come to Pennsylvania and to see what they could do here. And the idea was to bring the various denominations here closer together and to provide services to settlers here, because there were hardly any Lutheran pastors or Reformed pastors, and Moravians believed that they could offer, that they could baptize children, that they could preach to these people, bring them closer together, and they didn't really want to copy the denominational divisions that existed in Europe. They had hoped that in the New World, the church would be the church and not focus on the differences. That didn't work out. But Bethlehem became then the center for Moravian activity, and some of these people from Skippack moved to Bethlehem, and Bethlehem then also took on the role of doing missions among the American Indians, which was for many years an important part of their work. Later, education became important for the Indians in Bethlehem.
Thank you. That helps to make the connection.
Right.
We toured the museum up there, Moravian University, and I was looking out back at the cemetery and everything was flat, and they explained to me that in death the Moravians believed everybody was equal. I thought that was a wonderful concept, as it was explained to me. And the number two, my family comes from Ireland, and we had a number of students living with us from Ireland years ago, and one of our people, we used to take students from Elizabethtown College to foreign countries as part of her job there at the college. And one of the schools we went to outside of Belfast, Northern Ireland, the teacher, Julian Mathers was her name, and she invited us out to her village where she grew up, and it looked remarkably like Bethlehem, little village and the church and the square and the, the grounds in front. And her mother was Moravian. So this was a Moravian settlement in Northern Ireland called Springfield. You're correct. And we were startled, we stumbled upon it. We went to visit her mother, and she lived across the street from the square and the church, and reminded me remarkably of the old country, and then also the Bethlehem architecture and layout.
Have you been there?
I have not been to Grayshill, but we've had a lot of dealings with Grayshill recently because Bethlehem is working with Grayshill in Northern Ireland and with Herrnhut in Germany to become a transnational site of the World Heritage. So the UNESCO World Heritage site would include Herrnhut, Grayshill, and Bethlehem, and there is already one Moravian community in Denmark, Christiansveld, on that list of World Heritage. And so we've had a lot of conversations with people in Grayshill and in Herrnhut about the similarities and about the differences. And if everything goes all right, then next year, Bethlehem and its other communities are supposed to be added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage. But in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland, there were various Moravian communities. Grayshill was like a settlement, like Bethlehem or Nazareth or Lidditz, but then there were many Moravian called societies where there was the church in the countryside and people would come to church. And the rules and regulations weren't as strict as in the settlement congregations. Acre, the cemetery in Grayshill or in Herrnhut and Bethlehem, they all look the same with black headstones. And people are buried not in family plots, but they are buried, there's a section for single women, there's a section for single men, section for married men, married women, and then there's sections for children. And people are buried in the order that they die in those sections.
I know there's a historic plaque in Grayshill when you come in on the main road there, and I can't remember the age of it, but how did they get there? I mean, how was that established? I mean, I know about the migration to Pennsylvania, Germantown, coming in through the port, and how Pennsylvania was settled, but how did they get to Northern Ireland, all places?
Yeah. So Moravians did go out to do mission work in non-Christian areas, but within Europe, they were looking for people who were thinking similarly, and they found them in the Netherlands among the Mennonites predominantly. And in England, there were evangelical or people who were itinerant preachers who joined the Moravians and traveled around and established preaching stations. And in the 1740s and 1750s, a lot of people wanted to join the Moravians. In fact, so many people wanted to join that the church was very, very strict about who was admitted and who was not. That changed by the end of the 18th century, that for a couple of decades, Moravians were a movement that attracted a lot of attention in Europe and overseas. And I believe that I'm not really sure who the contact persons were in Ireland at that time that to the establishment of these communities there. Now the Moravian Church in Great Britain and Ireland is very, very small. I think there are about 2,500 members within the United Kingdom. And so that's very small.
It is small, yeah. Especially when you consider in Northern Ireland, which is history of Britain and partition and everything. And then the official church really is Presbyterian from Scotland. It's just amazing. And then my name's McFarland from Miles County, Scotland. We went to Belfast and opened the phone book. And it was like 3 pages of McFarland. I said, oh my God, who are all these people, you know?
They were looking for the rich relatives.
Yeah, they were all not. They couldn't find. Yes.
So I'm thinking like the marketing department of the press right now. Right? I'm thinking like the marketing department of the press right now. And somebody said a 300-year anniversary. Did that have anything to do with why you took on the project, or were you going for that? Were you looking to publish this book on a certain anniversary? Was that all in your thinking, or did you think of the person you work with?
I had the idea to write about Herrnhut for a long time because, whenever you write on the Moravians, you have to explain Herrnhut, and then it was always like, what do I quote here? It's literature. And I thought, we need new literature. But then with the anniversary coming up, I thought, well, that could be a good point to write this book and to have that as a goal. But I was only when it was finished, I contacted the publisher. So the publisher was not involved in pushing for that.
Okay. And how long did it take you to write the book, to research and write the book?
I think I started doing the research in 2015 and started writing in 2019. And then in 2021 was when the manuscripts had to be submitted. Yeah.
You look at the original inhabitants of Herrnhut. How is it that they're traced back to this problem in the 1400s? Is it the genetic or ancestral lineage, or is there some other evidence that links the two?
So apparently, in some of the communities in Bohemia and Moravia, Protestants continue to practice continue to worship together, and people from the outside, from Germany or from Hungary, would come to do baptisms and things like that, or they would baptize in Roman Catholic churches. It depended on the region how tolerant the ruler was. So yes, we can see that some of it did actually continue, and so that you can trace that through families, and some of the people who came to him were aware of their family history. We see that by around 1720, all of a sudden, the rulers tried to impose their rules, and only the Roman Catholic Church was allowed, and they would go around and take the books from the people, Protestant books, and put people in jail for holding house meetings. So all of a sudden, we see another wave of suppression, and that caused some of these people to go to Herrnhut. And yes, we can trace some of them back through their family histories. Others were just looking for a way to express their religion in a different place where there was no suppression in that way. But most of the people who came out of Bohemia and Moravia and went to Germany, you had to join the Lutheran Church, and you had to fit in the Lutheran Church structure. And so that was often difficult for Protestant refugees. And I think that was one of the attractive things in Herrnhut, because Zinzendorf did not want that, did not say you have to join the Lutheran Church, and they didn't have to choose a denomination. They just didn't care about Reform or Lutheran or whatever, and they just wanted to be Protestant.
Why was it important to Zinzendorf to make his, I don't know what you call it, identical, or why did he want to find the similarities between this older document and his document? Like, what did that do for him and the community?
Yes. So the chronology is that Zinzendorf introduced the brotherly agreement in May of 1727, and then in July he starts reading Comenius. And in Comenius he finds these things and said, oh, they already, and that's exactly what we did in the brotherly agreement. So apparently this is the tradition of these people that live on my estate. And for him, that was a confirmation of that what he was doing was God's work, and that unknowingly he had reinstituted these rules. When you look closely at what he was doing, he was translating. And anyone who knows, when you translate, you try to choose the words of your audience. And Zinzendorf was very good at that. So he translated words from the Latin into German, but those were the terms they were using in Herrnhut. So a big thing in Herrnhut was the Singstunden, a worship service where they would sing. So he would used the word Singstund, where in the Latin there was nothing about Singstund. It was about a musical practice that they did in the evenings where they played their instrument. Well, he translated that as Singstund. And the people in Herrnhut, oh yes, that's what we do. Or the board of elders, you can choose whatever term, but he chose Ältestenkonferenz, which was the term that they used in Herrnhut. So by choosing certain terminology, he made the suggestion that there were all these similarities was even bigger. And he left out certain parts of the text that did not match. So it was in a way manipulating the translation to I think if I wanted to defend him, I would say he had come to this realization and he wanted to absolutely convince the people in Herrnhut. So he exaggerated the translation. But, and I'm not the one who discovered this. An archivist in Herrnhut discovered this in the 1730s. And he wrote this essay about Zinzendorf's translation, and it's typewritten, and it's never been published. And the reason for that is 1937, the possibilities to publish scholarly material was quickly ending in Germany, and then after the war, there was no possibility either. So this was just a document in the archives, and people thought, oh, this is another copy of the brotherly agreement. But no, it was in fact a treatise by a former archivist about Zinzendorf, and he calls it falsification of records. And he was really, really upset with Zinzendorf that he falsified this. I don't think that was the intention, but Zinzendorf also knew that just quoting from someone else's text is different than what he had done. He had changed Comenius' text to match whatever he did in there.
So the connection to the Hussite is somewhat fictive.
So the Moravians then decided, in 1727, they said, okay, we are the renewed Moravian Church. Mm-hmm. So then they connected with these traditions. Some people did indeed descend from families who were part of that. Mm-hmm. And then they looked up in hymnals, what were the hymns that they sang there? So they introduced those hymns in Herrnhut. They introduced certain offices. So in the Moravian Church, ordained ministry is the deacons, the presbyters, and the bishops. That was exactly the same way as they did in the Unity of Brethren. They introduced the office of acolyte and did that in the same way as they did in the Unity of Brethren. So they consciously, intentionally copied things from the earlier history just to make sure that there was continuation. Then they went to Jablonski, who was the chaplain at the court in Berlin, and he was I always get this wrong, was he the grandson of Comenius or the son-in-law of Comenius? I always forget what it was exactly, but he was a descendant of Comenius. Comenius, John Amos Comenius, was the last bishop of the Unity of Brethren, and this was a descendant, and he was ordained bishop in the Polish branch of the Unity of Brethren, and Jablonski then ordained the first Herrnhut Moravian. So they made sure that there was this continuation in the episcopacy of the Moravian Church. So I always think the Moravians believe that they are a continuation. And from a legal point of view, no. There's no continuation of property or any legal entity, but Moravians believe they were the continuation. But then, at the same time, there was a branch in Poland of people who had emigrated from Bohemia and continued the church there. And there was hardly any connection between those two branches. So I wouldn't say fictive, but it's trash.
Okay. I mean, it seemed to me from your book that what was happening in Bohemia was this sort of a generic Protestantism that was stealing from many different, whatever they could get. It seemed to be its main characteristic was it was not Catholic.
Yes.
And so I was trying to figure out what really connection to the Hussite thing is there. And it seemed to me to be pretty tenuous.
Yes. The Hussites also had a very bad reputation in Central Europe. So Moravians always assured, well, we might be descendants of that church, but we're not Hussites because they didn't want to be held for people who, for the violent past of the Hussites in Central Europe. Something else on this comment, but it's an interesting point, and the Moravian Church nowadays claims to be one of the oldest Protestant denominations, and we celebrated the 550th anniversary of the church. In a way, yes, it's correct, but there's always a but. And I think I've tried to explain how this renewal and this adoption of this identity came about. And Zindler was very, very clear. He said it's a mask that we have to use because as descendants of this older church, we are respected in Europe. And without that, we could not have this Philadelphian group survive as an independence.
So you think that in his mind he would parse it as that they were spiritual descendants, not so much literal descendants?
Yes, many were spiritual descendants who were not from Moravia themselves,
Right.
but a lot of the people from Moravia could prove that they had gone back to that church.
So, how, you said, of course, Zinzendorf also has training as in the law. So, was he also, or how was he also using this connection? I mean, this is implied when you said of the mask, but beyond that metaphor of the mask, how is he using this narrative for the legal benefit of the church and not just the, I mean, as you said, he believes this is he has this epiphany of, oh, spiritually we're the same, but he's also using it as a legal strategy.
Yes. And I have read the text of the Peace of Westphalia, and there were certain formulations that appear in Zinzendorf's argumentation towards the Saxon government. And I cannot quote these right now, but it dawned on me when I was reading that Zinzendorf was using the legal terminology of the Peace of Westphalia that established the religious order in the Holy Roman Empire to convince that peace treaty leaves room for other groups that are not part of the three big denominations, and that they should be tolerated and cannot be persecuted, for example, and cannot be pressured into believing something else. And I think that he did that as a lawyer. If you want to get something done, you go back to the text of the law and argue in that sense. And he did that.
And by connecting to a group that predates Westphalia, that's part of that's helpful legally. Yeah. Today we're not in new group. Have in this new interpretation or explanation, have you gotten what has been the response from the Moravian Church when you say it's the 550th anniversary, but is there a response or a reaction or frustration that you're inserting the but into the story?
Yes. One colleague said to me, "Oh, your book, it will be a while before people accept this." I have, surprisingly, people do not come to me and say, "Oh, this is all nonsense, and how can you say this?" They might say this to other people, I don't know, but I think most people are also realize that there's one thing that we hear in Sunday school, and when scholars look at material and stories often more nuanced. Yes, I have not really heard that people were very upset about changing the order a little bit, or say, well, are we really the continuation of this early church? I always think that Moravians believe that that's the case, and we cannot argue with belief. Yes.
Hi. I'm fascinated fascinated also by the background in Moravia, and it's probably too much to expect, but did anyone ever, is there anyone write down anything like an oral history of, the earlier times? And that would be going back 300 years, even as of 1700. But I wonder if any of the Zeisbergers or anyone, played that. And then I also wonder, was the crackdown around 1720, is that at all related to what was going on in Salzburg with the Lutherans? And then the other thing is, you said that not all of those, who left and came to Herrnhut, not all of them fit in there or whatever, and some of them came to Georgia or whatever. So why did some of those old timers not fit in?
So to start with your last question, in 1732, the Saxon government did believe Zinzendorf that yes, this was a group of people belonging to the Unity of the Brethren. They adhered to Lutheran traditions, to the Lutheran teaching, but they did not allow, or they were threatening that new people were not allowed to come to Herrnhut, but the stream of people continued. So in 1732, the Schwenkfelders were told, they were also living there, you have to leave. The Schwenkfelders left to Pennsylvania. But then it was also clear that new people couldn't settle in Herrnhut, and maybe the government would change its mind. And so they were looking for other places. And one of the places they found was Georgia, because the trustees of Georgia were looking for colonists to come there. Then you asked about the Salzburgers. Yes, it's exactly the same time. And the Salzburgers were Protestant Lutherans that had to leave, and then they left the big roads and traveled through Europe. And a lot of people were very much impressed with seeing people leaving everything behind because of their faith. And that created a lot of goodwill among Protestants in Europe. And the authors, so the people who wrote about the Salzburgers, also wrote about the Moravians. So at that time, people were interested in that. And it was the same pressure that was put on Protestants within the Habsburg Empire. And your first question was about oral histories. These people in Herrnhut, they told their stories over and over again. So they would relate to each other how it was when they lived in Moravia, how it was when they had to meet in houses, when they had to hide their books and in attics, or they would bury them in the yard. And then they kept telling these stories, and they would write them down. But very interesting is when we read when John West goes to Herrnhut in 1738, he talks to these people, and these people tell him these same stories. So Wesley writes them down in his journals, the same stories that we know from other sources, where the people have written them down themselves, or others have documented that. So yes, there was a lot of oral history going on, and a lot of that was written down in various places.
But the stories that traveled back to the early outside of the unity thought. Did they themselves see that connection?
Yes, they saw that connection, but when you would ask them, so what was the theology? And what was the worship service about? It doesn't appear that they knew that. So they knew that their family belonged to this Protestant church and what it was called, and that sometimes they did have a hymn book, or they had a Bible in Czech or in German, but they could not explain the real theology or the customs or the organization of that church. So when you talk about the continuity, if these people had known all that, so we were told, I grew up as a Moravian, we grew up thinking that these people came to Herrnhut to reestablish their church. And if that was the case, then they would have dropped these customs, and then they would have said, okay, now we want to do this, because this is what our ancestors did. And that didn't even happen in these early years. They were just happy to be somewhere where they were not pressured to become Roman Catholics. And so this, we're talking about the 1720s.
Protestantism was defeated in 1620. There was a century in between. And yes, there was some recollection, but the details were lost. They were forgotten.
So the unity of the brethren that was in Poland, did they have more of a continuity of understanding?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yes. And my question, and I don't go into detail about that in the book, is why did the people in Herrnhut not work closely together with the people in Poland? They didn't.
Yeah.
And that church continued until 1945. That's when the Polish branch of the Unity finally ended. So that continued for a long time.
What did they do then? Where did they go after that?
Well, after the Second World War, all German speakers had to leave. Both became Polish territory, so people were dispersed, and by that time it was very small. So that, yeah, it was gone. Don't see any questions anymore, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Peucker. As you leave this evening, I'd like to invite you back in just over 3 weeks from now, Thursday, October 12th. Join us here for a presentation by Dr. Brianna Nickel, Professor of Religious Studies at Goshen College in Indiana, who will be discussing the 16th century Anabaptist theologian Balthasar Hoopmeyer and his role in the infamous expulsion of the Jews from Regensburg. Based on archival research in Regensburg, this talk by Nicole will reconstruct the kind of anti-Judaic sentiment that was prevalent in the city in the context of the Reformation and explore whether Hoopmeyer can be considered representative of wider Jewish Anabaptist relations in the 16th century. Special thanks this evening to support staff from Information Technology Services who made this recording possible, and thank you to Elizabethtown College for its support of the MSAC. Have a good evening and safe travels as you return home.
Thank you.